pick up one of each one. I asked them that already. Yeah, I know it. I know it. Well, I kind of left them out because I thought you'd be coming in, so I had them ready too. So this is a contract. Pretty much the same rules apply as any other contract. We talk about what things are required. You got to have mutual agreement, which just means the two parties have to what? Have to agree. You have to have that meeting of the minds. You need offer and acceptance. Same idea. You need consideration. What do we say consideration was? Think back to chapter 8. What do we say consideration was? The promise of what?
Money.
Of money or something of value being exchanged. Remember, it doesn't have to have been exchanged already, but there has to be the promise of it. So just like with a sales contract, a sales contract is not enforceable if it's for no money. A lease is not enforceable if you're not paying what? Rent. The payment of, or the promise of, the payment of compensation is necessary for a lease to be a contract. And of course, you got to be 18 years old, you've got to be sober, you've got to be mentally competent. All those same capacity rules apply. So, a lease that was signed by a 17-year-old would be voidable, just like a sales contract that was signed by a 17-year-old would be voidable. Same exact rules apply because they're really just contracts. This vocabulary word you probably need to know for a test. And it is one that you're just going to have to memorize. This needs to go on a flashcard. It needs to be something that you focus yourself on because there's nothing to it but memorizing it. And memorizing what it is and what it is not. Upfitting is a specific term that happens in commercial leases. Upfitting only happens when a property is leased in a commercial setting. Here's what's happening. The landlord is customizing the property for the tenant. It's not fixing it up. It's not repairing. It's not updating even. All those things just go in the category of general maintenance. Upfit is the tenant needs it for a specific purpose. So give me an example of a commercial tenant, what they might need for a specific purpose about a space they rent.
Barber chairs.
I'm sorry? Barber chairs. So even get more, let's go down that same thought process. If we're opening a barber shop or a salon of some type, are they going to have different plumbing needs than are probably in that in that space? Because they're going to need the hair wash stations, right? Whether that's at each individual chair or whether that's a place in the back where they go, but there's going to be the need for additional plumbing to meet that need. Does that make sense for everybody? Having that installed, but being installed by the landlord would be considered an upfit. The landlord comes in and does things like that to attract a tenant. It's a carrot. It's a reward that the landlord dangles out there and says, well, if you will sign this lease, if you'll commit to this length of period of time, we'll do this for you. So, because ordinarily, if you came in and you wanted to open a salon in a space that was not already a salon, the first thing you're going to have to do is jackhammer the floor and put in plumbing, and is that going to be really expensive for a tenant to do? So the landlord might offer to do that as upfit for the tenant. The key thing here is upfit is not something you do to make the space more desirable to any tenant. It's something you do specifically for that tenant. So usually it's not done before you try to market the property. You usually just offer it as a way to give the tenant to sign the lease, and then once they sign the lease, you complete the upfit. So other examples of things that would be like upfit, for example, that happen a lot in commercial real estate. This space, this was all offices. This is primarily an office building, right? And so this space was all divided into offices. As a matter of fact, this room, if I remember correctly, well, you can see the division right there. There was a wall right there, and that was 2 offices on the back wall over there. And then there was a 3rd office on this back wall where that closet was. And then I think these were 2 large conference rooms out here. So this classroom is essentially built from 5 offices. So part of our upfit, when we signed the lease and committed to this space, was that the landlord agreed to come in here and knock out those walls and put down new flooring, and because they're customizing the space exactly the way we needed it. And the reason they're willing to do that is because you're committing to such a long-term lease. That's why this only happens in commercial real estate, because the leases are much longer term. And it's a way to grease the skid so that the tenant can afford to move into your building, because a lot of times, otherwise, you'd never be able to convince a tenant to move. Think of a tenant who's running the barber shop or the hair salon, and you say to them, well, we'd love you to come rent our space. And they're like, man, I can't afford to move because I'd have to do $50,000 worth of plumbing work to get my stuff in your building. And that, even if I don't want to stay where I'm at, I just can't even afford to move. Upfit would be a way you would handle that, because the landlord would say, I'll take care of that. You don't worry about that. I'll take care of that. Let's just talk about a lease. Does that make sense for everybody? That's an upfit. It's an upfit. It happens very commonly. And as a matter of fact, in commercial real estate, they usually, most commercial leases give you an allowance for upfit as part of the lease. You know, you sign a lease and you're allowed $50,000 worth of upfit or $100,000 worth of upfit, and that's negotiable, just like everything else is. So, you know, it is a major part of commercial leasing. We okay with that idea? Good with? Don't, on a test, answer that upfit is upgrading. It's not an upgrade. It's not fixing up. Just because the word up is in there does not mean it's the same thing. Because in some cases, a lot of people could consider upfit to be a downgrade. I mean, I've seen places that were like a restaurant before, and it had all kinds of nice fixtures and that sort of thing in there, and the next tenant that comes into that place wants to use it as a retail store, and the first thing they do is go in there with, you know, pretty much a bulldozer and knock down that beautiful bar and tear up those hardwood floors, and they go back to bare concrete and bare walls. That's still considered upfit, even though it's not really upgrading the space, because it's customizing it to what that tenant needs it for. Commercial real estate, you don't ever look at, you basically, when you shop for commercial real estate, you're really looking at the location and what we call the floor plate. You don't need to know that terminology, but it's called the floor plate. Can my business function in this floor plate, in this outline? Because the walls inside can pretty much all be moved. The only thing you have to worry about in buildings like this are like these columns right here, you know, and that sort of dictated the way we laid out the classrooms in this building, because we had these two columns on this side of the building which could not be moved. And so that sort of dictates the way you lay out the rest of the building to work around that kind of stuff. And of course the bathrooms could be moved, but they're really expensive, so you try to work around that stuff. But everything else, they don't care about these walls, man. They tear them down in a heartbeat. Move them. That's just part of the deal, commercial real estate. Assignments and subleases. Well, we've already talked about assignment with purchase contracts. Assignment in leases works the same way. What did we say an assignment was? What is changing about an agreement? Is it the agreement itself that's changing, or is it something else? The person, the party. So if we do an assignment of a lease, what do you think is happening? What party is probably changing? The landlord or the tenant? The tenant. Usually what's happening with an assignment is that for some reason, whatever that reason might be, the tenant is coming off of the lease and a new tenant is substituting in. Maybe they went out of business and they're bringing a new tenant in. A sublease is similar, but what the difference between an assignment and a sublease is that in the case of a sublease, the original tenant never actually comes off of the lease. They simply release the space to somebody else, and usually for less money. Often when you see subleasing, they're leasing for less money. That's not because they can afford to give somebody a deal. They're taking a loss on the thing. But better to take a small loss than a big loss. Imagine if you've leased this space. This is almost 5,000 square feet, this real estate school, for 7 years, and that's the length of our lease. And 2 years in, you have to shut it down. Well, you're still on the hook for 5 years worth of that lease. Does that make sense for everybody? Imagine I find, let's say, a church. There's churches like big open spaces that would be willing to come in here and lease this space, but I'm paying $18 a square foot and they're only willing to pay $14 a square foot. I could sublease it to them for $14 a square foot, but how much is the rent still being paid to the landlord? 18, and who's paying the difference? The original tenant is. That's the difference between an assignment and a sublease. In an assignment, the original tenant comes off of the lease and the new tenant comes on, so all of that responsibility goes to the new tenant. In a sublease, the responsibility stays with the original tenant. They're just trying to find somebody else to help cover that cost. Yes?
Just going on the side note, are there pre-printed forms for this, like from Association of Realtors?
For commercial leases or for leases in general?
For residential leases for assignment?
For residential leases for assignment?
Yeah.
No. No. There are pre-printed residential leases from the association, but not assignment leases. Generally, in the residential side, assignments are very uncommon. The reason for that is, in most residential leases, the term is very short. By comparison, I know a year seems like a long time, but to people in real estate, a year is like, I mean, when you get into, especially when you get into commercial leasing, the conversation starts at 7 years. That's usually a short term commercial lease. Some commercial leases easily run 20 years with different, option renewal periods and that sort of thing. I wonder what Belk's lease looks like at Crabtree Valley Mall. How many years do you think they have on that lease at any given time? I bet you they never get it less than 10. I bet every time it gets to 10, they probably bump it back up to 20 probably, or 25 if I had to guess. And so residential leases by comparison are such a short term that there's just not much demand for assignments on them, because pretty much by the time you assign it to somebody, the lease would be over anyway. Is there a particular reason you were asking? Did you?
Yeah, so I lived in this house for a little over a year now, and one of my roommates will move to Charlotte in January to start her job as a CPA.
Right.
And so we worked it out with our property management company, and we talked about that in March, and then it was time, for our lease to,
renew.
automatically, they made a big deal about it, and they were like, oh, well, now we're gonna have to have this new thing drafted up or whatever. So now that makes sense. Now that I know that there's not a pre-printed.
There's not a pre-printed one.
Discussed it, so that was all then for not having that ready.
Yeah, exactly. There's not a pre-printed assignment version of. Now, on the commercial side, there's, on the commercial side, the lease is pretty much already planned for assignment. There's just a box you can check. This lease is or is not assignable. And so you can check is, then you've got to fill out some information about, under what conditions can the lease be assigned. But it's such an expected thing that it's dealt with on that side. Okay? Everybody good with assignment sublease? Differences there? Okay. Landlord's right to enter the property. Here's the best way I can describe it. The landlord doesn't have a right to enter the property. The landlord has given that right to the tenant. So the only way the landlord actually has the right to enter the property is if the landlord has reserved that right. How would a landlord reserve the right to enter the property? How would they keep the right? That's what reserve it means. How would they keep the right to enter the property? Put it in the lease. Put it in the lease in writing. If it's not in writing in the lease, then the landlord doesn't have the right to enter that property. Simple as that. You only have that right if you reserve that right. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Most of the time, landlords do, especially in residential leases, want to reserve that right to go in and do things like repairs, for example. But be very careful. If you ever go into property management, keys are the most dangerous thing you can have in your possession, because it's very tempting sometimes to use them, and that's called breaking and entering if you don't have the right to enter that property. So make sure you know. As we talked about before, leases don't have to be in writing because they're not covered by what law? What law would require them to be in writing to be enforceable? The Statute of Frauds, and they're not. However, leases that are for longer than 3 years are covered by the Statute of Frauds. So a lease that's for longer than 3 years, in order for it to be enforceable, must be what? In writing. And more than that, leases of more than 3 years should be recorded. Now, we're not saying they have to be, but they should be. So let's talk about leases and why this rule is here. When you buy a property, as the expression goes, the fleas come with the dog. So the tenants are part of the deal. The lease transfers with the property. The new owner has to honor the lease. Does that make sense for everybody? Unless, there's one exception. There's only one exception to that rule for a lease that a new owner does not have to honor. If the lease is for longer than a 3-year period of time and it's not been recorded. That's the only time a new owner would not have to honor that lease. If the lease is for longer than 3, so a lease shorter than 3 years, does the owner have to honor, the new owner have to honor it? Yes. A lease shorter than 3 years always has to be honored. See, here's the thing. You need to understand. Leases always have to be honored. Except, there's one exception where they don't have to be. If they are for longer than 3 years and they haven't been recorded. That's the only time a new owner doesn't have to honor a lease. So, shorter than 3 years, does the new owner have to honor it? Yes, every single time. If I buy a property though, and I find out after I purchase it that that property is leased, and the lease was longer than 3 years, I don't have to honor that lease unless it has been what? Recorded. The idea here is, if it was recorded, it would come up in my title search. Remember, I'm doing a title search when I buy this property. And so if it had been recorded, it would come up in my title search. And it's like a warning, like, hey, do you really want to buy this? Because if you buy it, you got a tenant for the next, what, 15 years, 18 years, 5 years, whatever that period of time happens to be. So whose best interest is it to record that lease? Is it in the landlord's best interest, or is it in the tenant's best interest? The tenant's best interest. Because it's the tenant who stands to lose. If they don't go and record that lease, and a new person comes in and buys the building, what can the new owner do? Kick them out. See you. But only if the lease is what? Longer than 3 years and it has not been recorded. So, if you ever find yourself in the position of representing a commercial tenant and they sign a lease that's longer than 3 years, where should you go as soon as you get it signed? Straight to the county courthouse to record it. As a matter of fact, it's interesting, when we got the lease for this facility, commercial lease, this thing's 82 pages long. And I read it, the whole daggum thing, read it. On the last page, last paragraph, the last page, it said, both parties agree that neither will record this lease in the Wake County Courthouse or any other legal facility in the state of North Carolina. They actually said that in the lease. The two parties agreed that they would not record it. So essentially what they're saying is that they don't want me as the tenant to be able to protect myself in case the building gets what? So I sent it back to them with a big X drawn through that paragraph. And I said, if you want me to sign it, you'll delete this paragraph. Well, their broker said, what do you mean? I don't even know what that means. Their listing broker didn't even know what it meant, because it had been drafted by the owner's attorney. And so the owner's attorney called me, and he said, listen, I got one question for you. He said, who in the hell told you to mark that paragraph out? And I said, nobody told me to mark that paragraph out. Why? Because I thought he was going to say, you're not an attorney. Well, I said, I don't have to be an attorney. I'm a party to that contract. Can I make a change to my own contract? Yeah, see, I'm not representing myself there. I am myself, right? And because I thought he was going to start that argument. And I said, nobody told me. I just knew I wanted to record this lease. I said, and moreover, not only am I not going to sign one that says I'm not going to record it, I'm telling you, the minute it's signed, I'm taking it to the Wake County Courthouse and recording it, because if y'all sell this building, you're not going to kick me out. And the guy started laughing on the other end of the phone. He said, let me tell you something. I've been doing this for 25 years and I've never had a single tenant that's caught that paragraph. Not one time in my entire practice have I had anybody that's ever even blinked an eye at that paragraph. He said, you got to be the only person in the state of North Carolina who knows that law. I said, you just happen to run up against a real estate instructor. But that's the deal. So if you ever end up representing a tenant and they have a lease longer than 3 years, you need to go record it to protect their interest. Because otherwise, it's not enforceable on that third party. It's always enforceable between the landlord and the tenant themselves, the ones that signed the lease. It's just the new owner that it wouldn't be enforceable on. It's there to protect, and you can understand why the law is there. Here's what it's there to protect against. Josh goes out and buys a property, and he finds out after the fact that the damn thing's leased for the next 15 years, and he can't use it. That would be really unfair to a purchaser. And so it's there to protect against that. That's the reason we say it has to be recorded, because Josh does his title search. It pops up in the title search. If he still moves forward with the purchase, well, you knew. You knew about it. Okay. Residential Rental Agreements Act. So this is going to certainly show up in the North Carolina specific section of the test. This is a law that governs residential, not commercial, not agricultural, just residential rentals in North Carolina. Residential rentals have lots of special rules and laws about them. And North Carolina is no different in that regard. You look at it this way. In every state, the most protected group of consumers is the residential tenant. No matter what state you go to, a residential tenant is going to get more protection from the state government than probably any other consumer is, because historically they were the most taken advantage of. Historically, the landlords got the better end of this deal always, because the landlords were more experienced, they had more knowledge about the law. So most states stepped up years ago and said, these tenants need protections. And so these protections are just there for residential leasing. If you're leasing it to live in it, that's when these restrictions come in. A couple of things you need to know about residential rentals. This first one is super important. Actually, both of these are super important. The warranty of habitability. We hit on that earlier. We said that if you're renting residential property, you as a landlord guarantee that it is safe for human habitation. That's what the statute says. The Residential Rental Agreements Act is a statute, a law in North Carolina, and it says that the property must be fit for human inhabitation. And then it goes on to say what human inhabitation is and what makes it safe. We'll talk about the details here in just a second. But look at the second bullet point. It says this is not negotiable. You can't trade off paying less rent for not fixing things. You're not allowed to do that in North Carolina, even if the landlord and tenant both want to do it. Could there be a time, like for example, if the heat goes out in the middle of winter, and the tenant calls the landlord and says, hey, our furnace is out. And the landlord goes, God, I don't know, I don't have the money for that. Well, the tenant may say, I tell you what, you drop my rent by $300 a month, we won't worry about it. I'll just use the fireplace. They may want to do that. They can't do it. They're not allowed to engage in that conversation in North Carolina, because in North Carolina, the law says that heat is a required service. It's a required feature of the property, and you can't negotiate that away. So basically that means repairs are always going to be the responsibility of the landlord. That's realistically what it brings us to. Now these are just some examples of things that are required in North Carolina of residential rentals. It says heat capable of maintaining 65 degrees. So on the coldest day of the year, whatever the permanently installed heat sources are in that house have to be able to maintain 65 degrees on the inside. That's one, for example. Working plumbing and electrical systems. I can't talk today, working plumbing and electrical systems. And then the last one, it says you're required to have what? Smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. Both smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. And I put that up there. I didn't really give you the detailed rules of smoke and carbon monoxide detectors because you don't need to know them for the test, but just for your reference, carbon monoxide detectors aren't really required in every property, but you may as well say they are. Because what the law says is that in any property that has an open flame or an attached garage, you need a carbon monoxide detector. So an open flame would be any kind of fireplace, gas water heater, gas furnace, gas stove, wood burning fireplace, all of those would be open flames, or an attached garage. So most properties fall into one of those two categories. So it's just easier to say that you got to have both smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. Now, one thing you might want to put in your notes, somebody mentioned to me recently that they were asked this question and they didn't know the answer, so I'm going to point it out to you. The landlord is not responsible for maintaining the batteries in the smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. They are responsible for providing the smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. What the law actually says is that the landlord will put fresh batteries in them when the tenant moves in, but past that point, they are the tenant's responsibility. So you must put the new batteries in when the tenant first moves into the property, but then it becomes their responsibility to maintain the batteries in the smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. So if you ever ask that question. As far as what happens if the landlord breaches the lease. And the most common reason the landlord breaches the lease is by not maintaining a habitable condition, by not maintaining the property. They won't fix something. Do you think that might be a problem from time to time in a residential lease? Something breaks and the landlord has been asked, they've been told, they've been sent it in writing, and they just aren't addressing the problem. Now, when that happens, the tenant has one right, and you need to know what it's called. It's called constructive eviction. Constructive eviction. This is not the landlord evicting the tenant. This is the tenant evicting themselves. This is a really fancy way of saying the tenant can do what? Leave, move out, break the lease. That's what it's permission to do. If the landlord's not maintaining the property adequately, then the tenant has the right to move out, to break the lease, to move on. That's what this law deals with. Now, let's talk about what they don't have the right to do. They don't have the right to withhold rent. They've always got to pay rent. Always. That's not negotiable. That's not something they can choose to do or choose not to do. So if the landlord hasn't come and fixed the heat, can the tenant say, I'm not paying you my rent until the heat gets fixed? No. And that is probably going to show up on a test. There's no way that the tenant can legally withhold rent. There's no way that the tenant can hire somebody and have the thing fixed and take it out of their rent. None of that is allowed. The tenant must pay rent as long as they're in the property. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay? You don't get to just decide I'm not going to pay rent. What's your one option if the landlord is not complying, if they won't fix it? Get out. Move out. Constructively evict yourself. Then you can stop paying rent. But you can only stop paying rent once you have vacated the property. As long as you're there, you pay rent. Everybody good with that? Now, it is possible, I will admit, to get rent back if you paid it and the landlord wasn't maintaining the property. So, like, let's say, we'll stick with our heat goes out story. Middle of winter, heat goes out. Tenant calls the landlord. And this is, let's just say this is January 5th. Tenant calls the landlord. On January 7th, the tenant hasn't heard anything back, so they email the landlord. On January 9th, the landlord emails back and says, yeah, we'll get to it next week. January 15th rolls around and still nothing's happened on the heat. The tenant emails the landlord and says, listen, if the heat's not fixed by Friday, I'm going to have to leave. Friday rolls around, nothing's happened, the tenant evicts themselves. So it's January 20th by that point in time. Does that make sense for everybody? The tenant has to pay for rent, has to pay rent all the way up to January 20th. As a matter of fact, they probably already have because they probably pay rent at the first of the month. So we usually pay rent in advance. Does that make sense? If the tenant decides, they can go file a lawsuit against the landlord to get the rent back for the period of time, not only that they moved out of the property, but the property was uninhabitable because it didn't have heat. So technically they could sue them and get the rent back all the way back to January 5th when the thing first broke. What they can't do is withhold rent. They can't, as long as they stay in there, they've got to pay. Other things about the Residential Rental Agreements Act, the legal eviction process is known as summary ejectment. So make sure you're familiar with that terminology. Summary ejectment is the legal eviction process. There are lots of illegal eviction process. We call those self-help evictions. Locking a tenant out of the house, showing up with a shotgun. That's a self-help eviction. That is all very much illegal. I had one guy in class one time that said, yeah, he knew a landlord that took all the toilets out of the house. The tenant wasn't paying rent, so they went in and took all the toilets out. And I heard somebody else one time say they took all the doors off the house.
I've heard that.
I'm like, oh my God. Not only is it petty, it's a felony. I mean, like, don't do that, you know, don't do that. There's one legal method to evict a tenant. It's called summary ejectment. So here's what you need to know about the summary ejectment process. It is a court action that is heard by a magistrate. Because it's a court action, it is slow. On average, it takes about 45 days to get a tenant out from the time you file for summary ejectment. That's average. It can be a little shorter, it can certainly be longer. Here's what I'll tell you. If you ever go into property management, learn to think outside the box. Don't rely on the summary ejectment process to get rid of a tenant that you need. What's the most likely reason you need to get rid of a tenant? Non-payment of rent, by far. Run away. I mean, you know, as far as like, number one, if you start ranking the top 5 reasons we evict a tenant, it's like non-payment of rent and nobody cares about anything else, because that's the one. Here's what you have to understand about that process. Number one, I can't even file until the rent is 10 days late. I'm not even allowed to file for eviction until the rent is 10 days late. They've got a grace period until the 6th. I can't file until the 11th. Okay? So now, I go and let's say I file on the 11th. I'm filing as soon, which nobody does, by the way. How many people do you think file on the first day they possibly can? Most people wait how long to file that? Usually at least the middle of the month, if not a full month, right? Usually people don't start to get panicked until they fall 2 months behind on the rent. When they owe us last month's rent and this month's rent, people start to get. So let's say they're 30 days late. So now we go file. Well, just because they're 30 days late doesn't mean they're going to move the case along faster. It takes the same amount of time. So it's going to take 45 days from the day we file to the day we get them out. Now, the day we file, they're going to get served by the county sheriff. What do you think the odds are that that tenant pays you any more rent from the time they get served to the time they are shown the door? They're not. So now you're already 30 days past due. Add 45 days to that. You're going to be sitting at 75 days with no rent by the time this tenant leaves. Does that make sense for everybody? And historically speaking, most tenants that you do evict in that manner do not exactly leave the property in a beautiful condition. It is generally trashed on the way out the door. And here's why. They know you're keeping their security deposit anyway because they haven't paid your rent. And they've usually given you a 1-month security deposit, right? They know you're going to keep it. They know they're not getting that money back. They're like, I don't care about damaging the property. They're keeping my security deposit anyway. So they just do whatever the heck they want to do. What I'm telling you is think outside the box. In my experience, when I got to the point where I wanted to file for summary ejectment on somebody, I didn't go to the courthouse first. I went to the house. And I went and talked to the person. And I always made them the same offer. I would knock on the door, and when they came to the door, I would say, Teresa, you know, you're behind by a month on your rent, and I understand things happen, but I hope you also understand I have a job to do. Here's the thing. I do not want to put you through a court proceeding. I don't want to drag you into court. I don't want you to have an eviction on your record because that's going to impact you being able to rent a property down the road. I don't want to ruin your credit by getting a judgment against you. I don't want to do any of that to you. But I have a job to do. There is a way I can do my job and not harm you in the process and actually give you your security deposit back in the process. Today's Monday. If you'll be out of here by 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and if you leave this property immaculate, I mean clean, scrubbed, so that I can have somebody else moving in here next week, I will write you a check for your security deposit, and I will forgive the rent that you owe us. I give you your money back, and I'll forgive the rent you owe us. Now, some people say that sounds crazy. They already owe you a month's rent, and you're going to let them off the hook. But think about it. If I go through the summary ejectment process, I'm going to go 2.5 months and not get any rent, and they're going to trash the place. If I can get them to move out by Friday of their own free will and give them their security deposit back, we come out way ahead on that. Do you see what I mean? And almost all of them would take me up on it in that regard. I had one time who wouldn't, and we did have to go through the summary ejectment process. But most people will take you up on that because they look at it as they're like, you know, well, I can get my security deposit back. I'm not going to have an eviction on my record. I can go rent something else. So, you know, and they see the positive outcome for themselves. So think outside the box. Summary ejectment sucks. It really does. Just know it's heard by a magistrate. If you ever see that on a test, it's a court case heard by a local magistrate. Protecting tenants at foreclosure. This is a law that every state has now, including North Carolina. We did not have this when the market collapsed in the mid to late 2000s, unfortunately. Give you an idea of what foreclosure looked like for a tenant in 2008. Imagine you're a tenant, you're renting a house, you're paying your rent on time every month. You come home one day and there's a notice on the front door from the Wake County Sheriff that says you have 10 days to vacate the property because it's been foreclosed on. That was the tenant's experience of foreclosure in North Carolina in 2008, because the tenant had no idea that the landlord wasn't making the mortgage payments. They were making their rent payments. They have no idea that the landlord's pocketing the money and not paying the mortgage. This happened thousands of times. And so what you ended up with was a tenant that essentially got kicked out on the street with no warning. Number one. Number two, did they get their security deposits back? No, because the landlord is long gone with that money as well. So the state legislature in 2009 passed a law called Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure, which basically says this: banks are not exempt from the same rules that the rest of us play by. If the bank obtains the property through a foreclosure sale, that's no different than you buying the property. If you bought the property, what would you have to do with the lease? You'd have to honor it. Guess what the bank has to do? They have to honor it. That's what the Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act says. It says if the bank forecloses on that property and they purchase it at a foreclosure sale, then the tenants are still there. As long as they have a written lease, and they can produce a written lease and prove that it's a real lease, then they have to honor it. The bank has to honor that lease, which is a much better outcome for the tenants. Because honestly, those people were some real victims of the foreclosure crisis. I mean, you talk about heartbreaking when you see somebody who's doing it right, paying their bills, and all of a sudden they're kicked out on the street, and they didn't have the cash to go do another deposit somewhere else. I mean, in some of these cases, people would pay 2 months security deposit. So they had, you know, if you were renting a property for $2,000 a month and you'd paid a $4,000 security deposit, and now you got 10 days to find a new place to relocate your family, I mean, that's just brutal. This law, I think, is a really good change. Everybody okay with that? Good, good. So let's talk about the security deposits. North Carolina has another law called the Tenant Security Deposit Act. Here's what's interesting about this law. This does not just apply to real estate brokers. It applies to everybody equally. One of the first requirements of the Tenant Security Deposit Act is that they must be held in a trust account. And that is true whether it's a real estate broker holding them or whether it's just a general property owner who's renting their own property. Any tenant security deposit in this state must be held in a trust account. So if you know somebody, your uncle who owns a house and rents it out, if he holds a tenant security deposit, he is required to have a trust account to hold that tenant security deposit in. Now, do you think that's a law that gets broken 1,000 times a day, every day? Yeah. Yes. Here's what those people don't understand who don't have the trust accounts. They don't really have a security deposit. They think they do, but what they don't have is a real security deposit, because if the tenant ever walked into court and said, Your Honor, I want my security deposit back because it wasn't held in a trust account, they would immediately be given it back. Because that's what state law says has to happen. Even if the landlord was otherwise entitled to it. I've seen that happen. I've seen in summary ejectment cases, I've been in court when they were evicting the tenant, and the tenant had not paid rent in 4 months. And the judge or magistrate, rules for summary ejectment and issues a judgment, says, okay, you've got a 1 month security deposit, so we're going to give you another judgment for 3 months worth of rent. And the tenant raises their hand and goes, Your Honor, they don't have my tenant security deposit in a trust account. And so the magistrate goes, is that true? And the landlord goes, what do you mean a trust account? And the magistrate says, okay, then refund them their security deposit and I'm going to give you a judgment for 4 months worth of rent. Rather than you keep their security deposit and I give you a judgment for 3 months worth of rent, you got a judgment, which is worthless because they're not going to pay it. And you got to refund them the security deposit because you didn't hold it appropriately. So that's the danger of not holding it in a trust account, is that you don't actually have a legal entitlement to it unless it's been held appropriately. And the tenant security deposit says it has to be held in a trust account. Yes, ma'am?
How would the tenant know that?
Well, if you go read the Tenant Security Deposit Act, it says that the lease should specify the location of the tenant security deposit. It's supposed to specify the bank branch location and the account number that the deposit is being held in, so that the tenant can go verify it. So that bare minimum, the tenant could go up to Bank of America and say, is this account number really a trust account for this person? So the lease is supposed to specify it. So if you look at like the standardized pre-printed leases, there's a place right at the end. It says, trust account location, address, and account number. So you're supposed to notify the tenant of where it's being held so that they know. Everybody good with that? The idea is to make sure that the landlord's not spending it. Because that's obviously the threat. That's obviously the fear, is that the landlord's going to spend the money, tenant moves out, and there's no money to refund because it's already been spent. It's one of the biggest problems with tenancies. As far as limits on security deposits, just like the state says that there are minimum notice time frames for a periodic tenancy, like if it's a month-to-month lease, you have to give at least 7 days notice to terminate it. The state also says that there are maximum security deposit amounts. So you don't have to charge a security deposit, but you can't charge more than this amount. So if it is a week-to-week tenancy, the most you can charge for a security deposit is 2 weeks. If it's month-to-month, the most you can charge is a month and a half, and anything longer than month-to-month, the most you can charge is 2 months. So no matter how long the lease is, you cannot charge a security deposit of more than 2 months. And I'll tell you why this law is here. This law is here because when the Fair Housing Act first passed in 1968, immediately tenant security deposits became the chosen way to discriminate while saying you weren't discriminating. Because if I wanted, for example, if I wanted Catherine to rent from me and I didn't want Yuchan to rent from me, then if they both are filling out an application, when Catherine fills her application, I say, okay, Catherine, you understand there's a 1 month security deposit on this property. And she's filling out her application. And then I come over here to Yuchan and say, Yuchan, we would sure love to have you. Now here's your lease application. Just so you know, there's a 1 year security deposit that we charge on this particular property. And that happened. It happened all the time. Because isn't that an easy way to say, oh, I'm not discriminating. We would happy to have her as long as she's willing to pay a 1 year security deposit. So what the state of North Carolina did, like pretty much every other state, was to come along and say, no, there's a maximum amount. You can't charge more than this because you can't use that as some sort of a discriminatory tool in your tool belt. And that's why these maximums are there.
If they set that, like if they say, okay, it's going to be 2 weeks, and they have to charge 2 weeks there.
They should be consistent. That's the other part of fair housing law. that was not understood back in the day of fair housing. I mean, keep in mind, our understanding of fair housing now is vastly different. Now, what we say about fair housing is in order to, it's not automatically a fair housing violation to say, Catherine, your security deposit's 1 month, you, John, yours is 2 months. That's not automatically a fair housing violation, but it's pretty dang close to being automatic because it becomes very hard to prove why I've made that difference between the two. Does that make sense? So, if you're smart and you're dealing in residential leases, you will be consistent with everybody. If you're charging a 1 month security deposit, then you're always charging a 1 month security deposit. I didn't waive them for anything, you know, because I didn't want to put myself in that position. Be saying I was picking favorites or whatever. It was just that was the policy. And we would have it in writing ahead of time so that people knew what it was before they even applied. So there wasn't this, you know, sort of awkward sort of, well, what are you going to charge me as a security deposit? I'm going to charge you the same thing I charge everybody else. What's written right there on that piece of paper? That's the easiest way, or the most consistent anyway. Everybody good on the limits here? Okay. Make sure you know those limits for the exam. Obviously, you can't use a security deposit for just anything, and that's another big part of the Tenant Security Deposit Act. What can we use this security deposit for? You're going to see this as a test question. What are the legal uses of a tenant security deposit? Now, let me tell you the first thing you need to know about using a tenant security deposit. Not even what you can use it for, but when you can get it. You can't get it before the tenant moves out. You can't touch the tenant security deposit before the tenant moves out. Think about that. People do it all the time though. What if the tenant owes you rent? They haven't paid you rent. People will look at this list and look, what's the first thing it says I can get out of the security deposit? Unpaid rent. So they think that means that gives them fair permission to go in there, go into trust account, and take out that security deposit while the tenant's still there. Well, they owe me rent. No. You can't touch this security deposit until the tenant has vacated the property. That's rule number one. Is everybody okay with that? For any reason. Then, once the tenant has vacated the property, you can look at this list of things and see, does this item I'd like to charge for fall under these categories of things? Is it unpaid rent? If so, then yes, I can deduct it from the security deposit. Is it damage? Now we're going to talk about that in more detail. Damage is not ordinary wear and tear. The state's pretty specific about what is and what is not ordinary wear and tear. We're going to talk about that in a second. But damage is okay to charge for. Wear and tear is not okay to charge for against the security deposit. Breaking the lease, non-fulfillment of the lease means the same thing. You moved out before the lease ended. You can charge for that from the security deposit. If they leave you parting gifts, cost of cleaning out the property, storing their stuff, you can charge from the security deposit. Cost of re-renting the property if they breach the lease. So like, let's say for example, a tenant moves out 2 years before the lease expires, and I have to spend $1,000 putting it in the newspaper to get it re-rented. I can deduct that cost from the tenant security deposit as well. Is everybody good on these things that can be charged? Okay? So, once we decide we're going to charge something, or once the tenant moves out, we have 30 days to do that. 30 days, and that you definitely need to know for the test. You got a 30-day time period from the day the tenant moves out to send them an accounting of their security deposit. So if you're refunding it, when does the refund have to come? Within what? Within 30 days after they move out. If you're sending them nothing but a statement of what you spent the money on, what do you have to do? Send it within 30 days. Here's another way that landlords get themselves screwed up. Tenant moves out, they owe you a month's rent. So landlord just think, well, everybody understands I'm keeping the tenant security deposit, they owed me a month's rent. And they never send a letter to the tenant saying why they kept the security deposit. 2 months later they get a lawsuit filed against them by the tenant who wants what? Security deposit. And are they going to get it back? Yes, because the landlord did not follow the law. So even if you're keeping the whole thing, you've got to send them an accounting within 30 days. Everybody good with that? Okay, good. So here's the difference between ordinary wear and tear and damage. Remember we said ordinary wear and tear we could not charge for. Damage we can charge for. Some examples of ordinary wear and tear. It's dirty. Pretty much dirt. It needs cleaning. That's wear and tear. That's not damage. People ask me this question all the time. Can they take the cost of cleaning the carpet out of my security deposit? And the answer is probably what? No. Probably not. Now, it does say stains and burns on carpet would be damage. But generally speaking, you're not going to know if the carpet's stained unless you've already tried to do what? Clean it. So if the stain came out when they cleaned it, it's not stained. And therefore you can't charge for the cleaning. Does everybody follow that line of thinking? Now, could I write in the lease that the tenant is responsible for the cost of steam cleaning the carpet? Could that be written in the lease? Yes, but I can't take it out of what? The security deposit. I'd have to bill them for it separately. That's where most owners mess up. They look at the security deposit like it's a slush fund that they can just take money out of whenever they feel like it. That's not the way it works. There are very specific things that can be charged out of a security deposit. So it says dirty or worn carpeting, peeling or cracked paint, general dirt or frayed curtains and blinds are all examples of normal wear and tear. Examples of damage: large holes, drawings on walls, stains and burns on carpet, broken windows and fixtures, unauthorized paint. That means they painted it without your what? Your knowledge or permission. They didn't ask if it was okay to paint. Or excessive filth. Now, if you're going to really charge somebody for excessive filth, you better have some pictures to back it up. You better take detailed pictures and it better be filthy. Like cockroaches flying out of the walls filthy. I mean, because I've seen some pretty nasty stuff that the judge said that's just wear and tear. I'm like, whoa. I don't know.
We got charged for, not in Barcelona now, but 2 years ago, for, like, we didn't have the type of, like the air filters that we put in there. We had just replaced them like 2 months ago. You don't replace them every 3 months. Or we did now. She charged us for that, and then light bulbs.
So here's a good question. Are either of those things allowed to be charged against the security deposit?
I mean, unless she had written it in there.
No, even if she can't write it in there. Those things are never allowed to be charged against the security deposit. Does that stop people from doing it? No. Because ultimately the only way for you to push back is to send her a nasty letter and say, you can't do this, here's a copy of the Tenant Security Deposit Act, but ultimately you really can't get your money back unless you're willing to do what? Take it to small claims court. And so so this is one of those sticking points with people all the time. They'll come to me and say, I thought you said they couldn't charge me for this. I did. Well, they did. Okay. What do you do about that? I don't know. Tell them to give me my money back. I'm like, no, I'm not telling them to do shit. That's not my job. That's a judge's job. You mean I got to go to court for that? Yes. How do you think you make people follow the law? You take them to court. So unless you're willing to go to court over it, it really kind of doesn't matter. Does that make sense for me? And that's why it gets abused so much. I will tell you this, generally speaking, in my experience, most people who are deducting things from the security deposit that aren't allowed don't really know they're doing something that's not allowed. They're just doing what they think is right. They've never actually looked at the rules. In my experience, if you send them a copy of the rules, because the rules are very detailed. Like if you actually pull up the law, it outlines pretty much every little thing about what you can charge for and what you can't. Send them a copy of the rules, highlight the thing that they're talking about and say, look, it says right here that's wear and tear. They'll most likely send you your money back. They'll usually send you a check. Right, if you say, listen, you can send me this back or I'll take you to small claims court, they're going to send it back. They're going to send it back. Most of the time, they either don't know that they did it wrong, or they're just taking the chance that you'll never say anything. How many apartment complexes do you think do this as a matter of course, automatically, because they know most people aren't going to push back against it? You know, they take money for cleaning carpets out of security deposits. They take money for recalking the tubs. I saw one time where it said, recalking the tubs. On what planet is that not the landlord's responsibility? But they charge for it, and I asked the tenant, I said, what'd you do about it? Oh, nothing. I'm like, that's why they did it. Because they do it all the time and nobody pushes back. So, you know, it really is about somebody has to push back. Are we good on this though? What the rules actually are. And then finally, last thing in chapter 11, and I know this kind of feels shoved in there, and it kind of sort of is, you don't need to know a lot about the Vacation Rental Act. Number one, there's not a lot on the test about it. Number two, we're not in an area that has vacation rentals, so it's probably not going to apply to you. But if you do end up renting short-term rentals, we call it the Vacation Rental Act. It should be called the Short-Term Rental Act. Here's why I say it should be called the Short-Term Rental Act. Technically speaking, there's a lot of rentals that go on now that this applies to that it never was meant for. Think about Airbnb and VRBO and those websites. Those really fall within the same law as these vacation rentals, even though this law was never intended. Here's why the Vacation Rental Act exists. If it didn't, and you rented a house to somebody for a week, and they wouldn't move out, what would be the only way you could get them out at the end of that tenancy? What's the only legal eviction process? Summary ejectment. And how long did I say that takes? 45 days. Can you imagine if you got a beach vacation rental house, how much money you would lose in 45 days it took to get them out? This thing rents for $6,000 a week, right? So the Vacation Rental Act is primarily there to make it legal to show up with a shotgun until you know you're leaving today. Pretty much like the way hotels evict you, right? If you're supposed to be out by 12 and you ain't out by 12:15, somebody's banging on a door. And that's what the Vacation Rental Act accomplishes. Here's the thing though. You can't do that as a landlord unless you prove this is truly a vacation rental property. And this is the criteria that you don't need to get too deep into, but you just need to know that if the tenant is leasing the property for less than 90 days and has a permanent residence somewhere else, then it's considered a vacation rental. Does that make sense for everybody? So if the tenant is leasing the property for less than 90 days and they have a permanent residence somewhere else, then you can consider it a vacation rental. But don't lease it to them for 91 days, because then it's a long-term rental. And make sure they got a residence somewhere else, because if they don't, it's a long-term rental. So what should your lease probably say? What is your home address? Give us your home address, because you need to prove they got some. The idea is if you're going to kick them out on short notice, they better have somewhere to what? Somewhere to go. That's the legal idea behind that. That's the Vacation Rental Act. Vacation rental is like the best area of real estate to practice in if you like to get paid. These people get paid first. They get paid before the transaction even happens. Vacation rental managers have already been paid for rentals that aren't happening until 5 years from now, because they get paid their management fee as soon as they take the reservation. They take their management fee out of the deposit. It's the only area of real estate I know where you get paid in advance. So like if they're managing these rental houses on the beach that rent for $6,000 a week, and they're charging a 10% management fee, and you go on their website and you reserve that thing, and you have to put down a $3,000 deposit, well, their fee for that week, $600. They get it then, right then. Even though you might not be renting the property for another 2 years from now, they got their $600 now.
We've got a beach house at Topsail, and then like you've never been in Topsail, every freaking house on Topsail Island are all rentals.
Uh-huh.
So,
Yep. Yep. Vacation rentals. It's a headache business. Because if you think about it, the biggest headache of dealing with tenants is having them come, move in and move out, right? Well, when you're managing a long-term rental, you do that once a year. You managing these, do it once a week. So it's a big undertaking. But it certainly has financial rewards. I mean, imagine if you're managing 20 of these things. And they rent for an average of $5,000 a week, which they easily could. That's $500 a week you're making off of each one of them. Times 20, $10,000 a week in revenue. That's not a bad income, right? So you don't have to manage a ton of those properties to make it worth your while. But it is a big headache, especially during a heavy season. Because they all coming and going on the same days usually. Yes, ma'am.
Why aren't Airbnbs regulated by this yet? I mean, do you think they will be?
That is just a perfect example of technology outpacing regulation. You know, it's sort of the same thing with Uber and Lyft and all those things. The reason they get around all the taxi rules and standards is because the taxi rules and standards were not written even contemplating that such a thing could exist. I mean, whoever thought you could go on your phone and tell some stranger to come pick you up in 5 minutes, you know, and so it will take a while for the regulations to match up with the technology. And we've probably reached a point where the regulations never will match up with the technology. I mean, because the technology changes so fast. So, I mean, you look at Uber and Lyft, when they first came on the scene, a lot of cities didn't allow them, you know, like they wouldn't allow them at the airports, they wouldn't allow them at the hotels, they wouldn't, you know, and they just tried to regulate it out of existence. But the problem was, every time they create a rule that was meant to stop them, Uber or Lyft would change their operating procedures just enough to make it work. And so finally, pretty much everywhere's given up on it. Now you go to the airports, they actually have a designated place for Uber and Lyft. I mean, for the longest time at RDU, if you were an Uber driver and you got caught dropping somebody off at the airport, it was a $500 fine. Now they actually have a designated pickup and drop-off spot. So, you know, it's one of those things where it's very hard for the regulations to keep up with that kind of technology. And Airbnb and VRBO are very much like that. All right? So tomorrow we will do Chapter 12, which is property management. And we should have time to get into real estate investment as well. So tomorrow will be a math day because property management is mostly math as well. And I'll see you then. You got, you know, the rest of today and tonight obviously to look over your midterm. And cry. Drown your sorrows.